love to let the rain linger. Grand Rising, good morning, welcome home. I've already lit my candle. There is in this place the possibility of healing, of repair, of making things right within ourselves, between us, and the wider world. We gather around this light of hope as we share this time together. Amen, Ashe, and may it be so.
Welcome everyone to Wedgewood this Sunday morning. Happy Sunday morning, happy Ramadan, happy International Women's Day as we celebrate and kind of focus on the women in our cultures today. And so we just welcome everyone. If you're here with us this morning live, wonderful. If you're listening to us on our video later in the day, even later in the week, we are, as a lot of you do, we are glad you chose to spend some time with Wedgewood this morning. So, with the theme of International Women's Day and Women's History Month, our prelude this morning is a song called Put a Woman in Charge. And I'm sure that woke us all up and got us moving this morning. It's hard for me to sit still with songs like that. I just want to move. So our words of wisdom this morning come from a poem, Let's Flap Our Wings and Fly Together by Aisha Islam. And Liz and I will read the words of wisdom. Let's flap our wings and fly together, break the chains of patriarchy forever. We stand united hand in hand, no longer silent, we take a stand.
We need more women in leadership roles, their ideas, their visions, and their goals. We own our bodies, we own our minds, we leave oppression far behind.
We lift each other up, we amplify our voice, we fight for our rights and our choice. Together we can reach the highest of heights and achieve our goals with all our might.
Let's build a world where love conquers hate and create a world where we can all celebrate, not just a dream, but a reality to see, where women are truly, completely free.
Amen.
Mm-hmm.
And now, as we continue our service, Liz has a few exciting announcements for Wedgewood.
Thank you, Melba. We do have just a few exciting announcements of upcoming events. Next Sunday, March 16th, a friend of Wedgewood from a very long time, Ben Snyder, an immigration attorney, will be speaking with us this coming Sunday, what you need to know about ICE. We've been talking a lot about immigration and the crisis that's going on, and Wedgewood's been actively involved in learning more about it and supporting for a number of years. So Ben is going to come and give us some updates specifically on ICE and what they're up to and how we can help. And this coming Tuesday, just a couple of days from now, we have our next Wedgewood monthly meetup at La Autentica Mexican Restaurant. If you're not doing anything this Tuesday, come out and join us. If you've never attended a Wedgewood social before, this is the perfect time to come. We just like to have time to hang out, be in fellowship with each other. You know, we love seeing each other on Zoom on Sunday mornings, but it's also important for us to meet together in person and have that fellowship time. So if you are not doing anything, come on out and join us. And our next Wedgewood Social Justice Book Club meeting will be Thursday, March 20th. We'll be discussing through Chapter 4 of The Tyranny of Merit, Can We Find the Common Good by Michael J. Sandel. It's been a really great discussion, really powerful conversations that have been happening. Come and learn, stay for the camaraderie. You don't have to be actually reading the book to participate, but come and listen and participate in the discussion. We'd love to have you. And we have our Wedgewood film series. We had our first planning session last Sunday. Our next one is going to be this afternoon at 4 p.m. on Zoom. Last year we had a film festival at the Independent Picture House, but this year we've decided to spice things up a little bit and do a film series over the course of a couple of months. That way we can focus on a couple of different topics that, are all interconnected, but we can have a little bit more variety, whereas we did our film festival last year and it was just on one topic. So if you'd like to participate in the next meeting, it is actually this afternoon at 4 p.m. We actually just use the Sunday Services Zoom link. So if you'd like to participate, just hop on, or you can send us a message. We'll add you to the email list. We'd love to have you because we're having some great discussions and we're going to be making some decisions today. So join us. And there are a number of ways to make your voices heard because there's so much going on in the world. It feels like every single day there's a new piece of chaos that's happening. And it can feel very overwhelming and like nothing that we do matters. But let me tell you, it really does, especially when one voice joins the chorus. That makes the chorus even stronger when the chorus is saying, stop. So if you want to be a part of that and make your voice heard, we use 5 Calls. It's a really great resource. And Wedgewood is not, sponsored by 5 Calls in any way. This is just a resource that we really find powerful. It's one of the many resources that we share out. It gives you a script. It will help you find your representatives and tell you what to say. It's a really great resource. So we encourage folks to use it. So we do a lot and we need your support to do it. So as you feel so moved, any offering is appreciated, whether you mail it or give online through Venmo, PayPal, or Zelle. We really appreciate any offering you can give. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Some exciting things coming up at Wedgewood. I'm excited about the meeting today. If you weren't part of that last year, it's really an exciting time as we all discuss the issues of the day and view some of the films. So join us this afternoon. We're really looking forward to that. And Ashanti will now lead us in our extravagant welcome.
We are all welcome here. Welcome. I hear an echo. Welcome to a community that works for peace, justice, equality, and care of Mother Earth. Altogether,
we are all welcome
here. All together. An extravagant welcome to you because of your gender identification, sexual orientation, ethnicity, economic situation, physical and mental challenges, doubting or believing, being depressed or full of joy.
We
are all welcome here.
We are a community of curious and creative spiritual seekers striving to learn and embody the way of servant leadership. We
are
all
welcome here.
We focus on the plundered and the marginalized as we try to address the major issues of our day. We
are
all welcome here.
And you are invited to share your passion, your inspiration, and your personal story as one of the ways we help heal the world. We
are all welcome here.
We are all welcome. Thank you.
Yes, everyone is welcome at Wedgewood. And we sincerely mean that. We come to a time of celebrations and concerns. I just want to say we had a great little outing yesterday of Wedgwoodians who went to see No Other Land. And then we had dinner at Portofino's and kind of debriefed and discussed the film. I would highly recommend it. Tom, you were there. Would you like to say anything?
It's like many of the Palestinian films that we have seen. It's very hard to watch and very hard to process, but it just deepens our understanding of what people are going through and the level of resistance that's being offered to the oppression that the Palestinian people are suffering.
And as you know, probably no other land won the Academy Award this past week for the best documentary, which I thought was just wonderful because it brings more attention to that issue. It is a powerful film. It really is, and I highly recommend that you see it. It will only be there for just a few days. Hadia, did you have anything to say about the film?
I mean, I think it puts on display very clearly what so many scholars have been arguing, especially more lately, Ta-Nehisi Coates, that this is an apartheid system. You see it right there. I mean, your Arab or Jewish ethnicity determines your right to existence, your right to be on that land. And it's so heartbreaking. It's so heartbreaking. And I like Tom, I felt like, and I watched it before it won the Oscar, and you just feel so much anger. And then, your emotions kind of evolve. Like first, you like my emotions, at least, like they started to evolve from like anger, depression to like then becoming numb to it all, like in the middle of it, like you just feel like this evolution of emotion. But then when I saw them won the Oscar after I watched it, right, I remembered what the Palestinian co-filmmaker said to Yuval, who's a Jewish filmmaker, and he told him, you want to do things quickly. These things take time, and it's like a drop of water, one drop, one drop, one drop. And I'm like, that's what it is. And we have to have that same resilience, recognizing that it's for the long run, that change will happen, but it will happen. It will take time for people's eyes and hearts to awaken to the reality of what's happening.
Thank you. It was amazing to me that they were able to film that and get out alive. That just amazing to me. So try to see it if you can while it is still playing. I know that we are remembering Tom's brother who is in hospice. We want to remember him. Are there others, or Tom, is there any kind of update on that, or? Okay. Any other concerns that we have, or celebrations? We've got 2 birthdays coming up this week to celebrate, Liz and Ashanti.
Yeah, I'm excited.
That'll be celebrations.
Yeah, I'm thankful to have another birthday.
Yeah.
Thomas has had some family visit he hasn't seen in a while, so that's always, well, we hope that's always a celebration. Sometimes it's not. Depends on the family, but I think he was happy to see this family.
Well, she gave me all the photographs that she had from my mother since
Oh.
1958.
Oh,
So
wow.
now how I process that, I do not know.
A little bit at a time.
Yeah.
And I know heavy on our hearts this morning are the concerns for the Ukrainians who are under great threat. We have worked with that community very closely. We know some of those people personally. And it's just very concerning, the threats being made. We are always concerned about what's happening in the Middle East with Palestine and Gaza and the threats being made there. I have family in Canada, so that's heavy on my heart, what's going on with Canada, because my family is there, and Canada's been our best neighbor and best friend for so long. So there's just so many concerns coming from our country today. I'm sorry and ashamed to say that we all need to be lifting up to the universe, to God, to Allah, to whoever we pray to. Are there other concerns or celebrations? Well, this time, as we have our moment of silence, as we always do, in respect to the different religions and beliefs that we have, if you believe in prayer, meditation, just need a silent time, it's up to you. But we're going to play, you probably remember Marina Alexandra, who has been at Wedgewood many times. In fact, we hosted a concert for her. She is a professional classic guitarist, and she plays all over the Southeast. And she has taught at Furman and other places, and she is a Ukrainian who came here and seeking help and seeking asylum. And so we want to just, while we have our quiet time, let's listen to a little bit of her music, and it is entitled Romance. Amen. Beautiful, very talented woman. And now I am very privileged to introduce to you, so most of you already know Hadia, uh, and we are thrilled that you are here today. Hadia is a professor at Queen's University, but most important, she's a friend. That's the most important thing. And we have been friends for a while now. And she's the kind of person that if I have a question that maybe is not what they call, and I don't like this term, politically correct, I can always ask her, and she understands that I'm not meaning to not be politically correct. I'm trying to learn. And so she's just that kind of wonderful, wonderful person and a friend to everybody. So, welcome. We are thrilled you are here today to talk to us about Muslim women in the pop culture today.
Thank you so much for having me, Melba, and it's really an honor to be at your service this morning. I first met Melba at a Ramadan
Yes,
gathering at a mosque. I think it was a year ago, right? It
yes.
feels like I feel like I've known you for longer because this 1 year I've known you, we've just done a lot of work together, and
Yes.
it's been incredible. I do have some PowerPoint slides. I'm gonna share my screen if that's okay. Um,
Ryan, can you give her screen share?
yeah, it looks like I need screen share if that's okay.
Yeah, let me hold on.
I think if you also make me co-host, that might be one option if you click on my name.
Yeah, I'm not the host of for the call today.
I might be able to. Hold
I don't think that I am.
If you click on like the three buttons next to my picture.
on. Yeah, Melba, you'll have to do it. If you hover your mouse over Hadia's picture or their window, then you'll see mute and the three white buttons in the blue.
I think she's co-host now.
Okay, let me see if I can share. Yep, I can share. Thank you. Thanks. Okay. So make sure I'm on the right screen. Yeah. So I want to talk about, some of my research. And Melba, can you remind me how much time I have?
Oh, 20, 25 minutes. I mean, we want to hear, so we're eager to hear.
Okay. So, I want to start out, it's International Women's Month. Muslim women and the topic of Muslim women is often really misunderstood for many reasons. And oftentimes it's because of this question of, what do we really mean when we say, women in Islam, or we say, you know, how are women treated in Islam? Are we really, when people say Islam, what do they really mean? Do they mean a religious tradition, a faith that transcends historical, that transcends time and space, you know, that basically spans several centuries and the entire globe from China to the West? Or do they mean, you know, oftentimes are they looking at a group like the Taliban, right? An Afghan resistance movement that emerged in the context of post-Soviet occupation of their country in the 1980s. Thinking really about Saudi Arabia when they're saying Islam, do they really mean Saudi Arabia, which is a modern nation state with its own peculiar policies, and also it's has a very, very unique orientation of Islam, which is Wahhabi Islam, from this religious political alliance that happened when that nation was created? Are they thinking about the Islamic Republic of Iran, another modern nation state that underwent significant regime change since the 1970s, right? There used to be a secular, very Western regime that was very autocratic and repressive at the same time that the West supported. And then in the 1970s, the pendulum swung in the other extreme, right? So I always tell my students, I'm like, Iran is the one country where in its recent history had first banned the hijab and then imposed the hijab, both by law. So there was a certain part of their history where they actually had banned women from wearing the headscarf. And then once the revolution happened, they actually then imposed it by law. I will mention there are only 2 countries today out of 57 countries with majority Muslim populations or substantial Muslim populations, only 2 that enforce the headscarf by law, and that's Iran and Afghanistan now, since the Taliban have taken over. But looking at 55 other countries, it's a choice, right, that women have. But going back to this question of, you know, what do we mean when we say Islam? Do we mean religious texts? And these 2 texts are the authoritative texts. It's the Quran, and then the text, the Hadith, which is the traditions of the Prophet. These are the authoritative religious texts. And even when it comes to the question of interpretation of these texts, there is a lot of pluralism. So interpretive tradition, that's a second category in and of itself, how Muslims historically have understood and interpreted these texts. And then the last category that people often conflate with Islam is lived experience, lived Islam, right? And that's not to say it's not to be included, but we have to be clear, what are we actually looking at? And this is where, you know, personal memoirs, state policies, culture, all this stuff gets projected on Islam when it's often really has nothing to do with the teachings of the text, the teachings of the Quran or the teachings of the Prophet. It's a state policy by Saudi Arabia, it's a state policy by Iran, Afghanistan. And yet we tend to kind of conflate all these things together. And I would say we really need to distinguish between these 3 categories. And one thing we need to remember is that Islam is not a place. This is, I'm quoting here Laila Abu Lughud, one of my favorite authors, and she's an anthropologist at Columbia University. She says Islam is not a place from which one can come, yet Islam land, as I would call this mythical place, anoints the call to arms for women with transparent goodness. Islam land enables those who advocate for women's rights to accrue moral capital. In the works of Abu Lughud critiques, Islam land is the problem, and Islam is condensed in the figure of the victimized Muslim woman. So I'm going to be giving some examples today of the way this idea of, you know, this diversity of 57 Muslim countries gets kind of collapsed in our Western imagination as this one place that just representing this religion, when oftentimes their policies have nothing to do with Islam whatsoever. And when it comes to Islam, the religious tradition, Muslims actually differ among themselves regarding very fundamental questions, like what are the criteria for salvation? What rights do women have in Islam? It's really important for us to remember that there's no singular Muslim experience or interpretation of Islam. And I'm going to give you here a case example when it comes to women in positions of political power. There have been 10 Muslim majority countries that have elected women as heads of state. 1988 was the first one. Pakistan, which is called the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, they actually based their country on their religious Muslim identity, elected the first female prime minister in the Muslim world, Benazir Bhutto, and she was elected twice. Bangladesh, a very also religious Muslim country, elected a female prime minister twice. And they also elected a second female prime minister, who was also elected 2 different times. Turkey has elected a female prime minister. Indonesia elected a female president. Kosovo, Senegal, Mali, Kyrgyzstan, all of these countries have elected women as heads of state. And then you also have 2 or 3 countries where Muslims are the minority, but they elected a Muslim female as head of state, and that's Mauritius, Tanzania. So this year is the president of Tanzania. And I want to say Singapore, if I'm not mistaken. There's 3 countries. So Mauritius and Tanzania are definitely 2 of them. And I love this picture here for many reasons, because here you have the French president who, hates the hijab and has a lot of internalized Islamophobia and showing deference to this, Muslim woman who is the head of her state, has the highest office in her state. I want to contrast that. I was talking about the pluralism of how Muslims experience Islam, how they interpret Islam, and then how they live their lives, which sometimes has nothing to do with their religion. But in contrast to all these other Muslim majority countries I shared with you, from Indonesia, which by the way has the largest population of Muslims in the world, is Indonesia, to Pakistan, to Bangladesh. In the contrast, who elected women as heads of state, you have countries like Kuwait, like Saudi Arabia, that didn't allow women to even vote, let alone run for municipal office until the 21st century. In Saudi Arabia, it's 2015, in Kuwait, it's 2005. Then you have kind of in between, you have countries like Morocco and Egypt and Jordan that at least have a quota in their parliament. Maybe they haven't had a female prime minister yet, but they have a quota where women a certain number of seats are reserved for women in their parliament. And so this was just kind of a case example of the diversity and really a very wide spectrum of how Muslims actually experience something like women in politics, right? You have the whole end of the gamut where women are heads of state, and then women were denied the right to vote until the 21st century in these other Muslim majority countries. And most of these countries, for the most part, except for Iran, are Sunni Muslim majority. So how do we explain the discrepancy? How do we explain the difference? Well, we can't go back to, we cannot try to explain everything through the lens of Islam. And that's where I would argue is the problem in Western discourses, is that we tend to think everything that happens in the Muslim world is a byproduct of their religion, right? So something horrific like 9/11, 2001, right? A horrific attack in our country. People start to open up the Quran and say, oh, let's try to understand the 7th century text to understand why 19 men did what they did in the 21st century. It doesn't work that way. That's a very flawed methodology, right? We don't do that when abortion clinic, bombers go and attack, a Christian, and thank God, we haven't had one of those in a while, but when you have a religious zealot and from the Christian community go and attack an abortion clinic, we don't say, oh, let's try to figure out what passage in the New Testament had motivated him, right? Like no one does that. We try to understand what was that person's psychology, what was his upbringing. Usually it's a him, right? what was his upbringing, what was psychologically going on in his life, right? But when it comes to and excuse my language, Muslim wackos, that's what I'm gonna call them. We try to put everything on the doormat of Islam. Oh, well, what text was it in the Quran? No, they also are human beings who have their own psychological issues and who become radicalized through socio-political, economic, for reasons, right? And we completely ignore them. So when it comes to Muslim women and the problems that do happen in the Muslim world, and there are problems, there are abuses, there is oppression, and I'm not going to deny that. But it tends to be case specific, right? We can't think that 1.8 billion people in the world, and that is the population of Muslims today, are a monolith, right? And how women are in one family is the same in the other family. So there are problems, but there's a flaw with applying a religious lens to try to understand these contemporary issues related to women in the Muslim world. And the second problem, and this is what I'm going to kind of focus on in the second half, is that there's a unique public appetite in the West for narratives about abused Muslim women. And this has been documented by Laila Abu Lughod, by Muhtar Khaf, by other professors who've shown that there is such a public appetite when it comes to the mass market publishing, and even it comes to reprinting these editions, specifically about stories, horrific stories about Muslim women's oppressions. And then what happens is that these stories become the lens through which we understand Muslim women's experiences. So rather than talking to Muslim women and getting to know their experiences, we read a book like reading Lolita in Tehran, or we read a book that's even a fictional book, 1001 Splendid, what was it called? Splendid Sons, right? I was about to say night. That's the medieval one. 1001 Splendid Sons. I don't know if anyone's read that about Afghanistan. It's one of my students told me you have to read it, and it is a very well-written book, but you do walk away with this idea that, you know, all Afghan women get up by their husbands, which is the farthest thing from the truth. And so then that fictional or non-fictional narrative becomes the lens through which many people experience or understand and perceive Muslim women's lives. This is another one, I Am Nujood, Age 10 and Divorce. And these books, which one professor has called them the genre of pulp nonfiction. She calls it pulp nonfiction for many reasons, that even though they are supposed to be nonfiction, they tend to be co-authored by a ghostwriter. They tend to be contextualized by culture. They are oftentimes, they disproportionately represent Muslim women's lives as oppressed and marked by violence, force, and coercion. And literally, like, I would even challenge you after this to go on Amazon and maybe specifically like the Kindle reader and look up, you know, novels on Muslim women or books on Muslim women and see how many of them are about stories of oppression and abuse. And not that these stories should not be told, they should, but it's disproportionate. And it tends to go hand in hand with a foreign policy in our country that wants to justify violence in these countries. And that's been called out by Laila Abu Lughad, and I'll give you a case example. But I want to go back, right? I'm going to try to keep track of time. I want to go back historically to just show that this language and this kind of fixation and obsession with Muslim women's welfare and status goes all the way back to the era of colonialism, of Western colonialism in the Muslim world, when this when Orientalism emerges as a kind of, it emerges as this academic discipline. You know, we're going to study this area we call the Orient, which Europe had colonized at the time. And we're going to study these people, but there's been many books, including the most important book, Edward Said's book, Orientalism, published in the 1970s, that displays through very, very rigorous documentation how Orientalism as an academic discipline was premised on the inferiority of Muslim societies and the superiority of Western societies. And so there was a lot of bias. And so Orientalism today comes to mean a lot of things. It also comes to mean a colonial language, a system of classification and artistic movement, and especially an attitude about the world. And that's really what I'll be focusing on. And Orientalism perpetuated this idea that Muslims are the opposite of the West. So if we're democratic, they're authoritarian. If we are, you know, egalitarian, they're misogynist. If we're law-abiding people, they're not law-abiding people. They're violent. And in fact, until today, I would argue that many movies, films, like even American Sniper, and shows like NCIS and 24 perpetuate this idea that Muslims are a different species and that they are the complete opposite of the West in terms ideologically, right? Like ideologically in terms of our values versus their values. But to go back to the colonial, how Orientalism was embedded in the colonial enterprise, Zachary Lockman, who wrote the book Contending Visions of the Middle East, argues that the ways in which writers, European scholars, writers, and artists analyzed, imagined, and depicted the Orient, which again was supposed to be seen as the Muslim world, were often intertwined in complex ways with the reality of growing power over those peoples and lands. And so there's all these different Orientalist assumptions. Again, I talked about this was an academic discipline, but it was premised on certain ideas of Muslims as stuck in a time and space removed from the West's trajectory of progress. This is why, by the way, a tragedy like 9/11 happens, or another tragedy like this guy in New Orleans, you know, who was in the US military and a US war veteran and had been stationed in Afghanistan, but happened to have a Muslim sounding name. And he committed an act of terrorism last winter, right? And immediately people try to go to some religious text to understand a phenomena that's happening centuries, literally over 15 centuries after this text came to be. And why is this happening? It comes from this Orientalist presumption that Muslims are stuck in a time and space removed from the West trajectory of progress, or this notion of the Muslim world as static and unchanging, right? It also comes from this idea of environmental determinism, that, you know, their environment makes them behave the way they behave. We can't civilize a Muslim man unless we take him out and import him, right, into our own communities. And I'm going to give you an example from Not Without My Daughter. And so there's this presumption that whatever a Muslim does, it must be because of their faith, right? Which is very, very problematic. In fact, it's one of the tenets of Islamophobia, although it looks a little bit different. One of the tenets of Islamophobia is that we assume that whatever happens in the Muslim world, you know, it's a byproduct of Islam. We really erase their modern history, their socio-political, economic conditions, right? So whether it's the emergence of the Taliban, we try to ignore, you know, all these like political conditions that led to their emergence, whether it's a group like Hezbollah, which, you know, Robert Pape has done so much research on the primary cause of suicide terrorism, right? And he says, empirically speaking, foreign occupation is the #1 cause. And he talks about a group like Hezbollah that emerges literally the same year, 1982, that Israel occupied southern Lebanon, right? So an Islamophobic lens would erase political circumstances. It would erase economic circumstances, and it would try to take us all the way back to the 7th century and assume that Muslims are just stuck in this, you know, in this time and space, and everything they do is a byproduct of their faith. And that's really reductionist. It's inaccurate, and it's the farthest from the truth. And but again, we're going to see how this it comes up in pop culture. So it tends to, again, we tend to view all these narratives of abuse that emerge through books, through movies, as a religious problem, when often it's an individual problem. Or if in the case of Iran, we're looking at a very particular regime that emerges in response to the West's support of another dictatorship, which was the Pahlavi regime. But gendered Orientalism is the name that I believe it's Laila Abu Lughod gives to this Orientalist obsession with, you know, saving Muslim women, if they will. And Zachary Lockman also argues that there's no subject connected with Islam which Europeans have thought more important than the condition of Muslim women. So here are some paintings, you know, you can see from the mid-19th century. This is, you know, one man, supposedly like a sultan, surrounded by these women who are just, you know, have nothing to do. This is, and a lot of these paintings, by the way, were a figment of the painter's imagination of what it must be like to be a Muslim woman. You know, this is from Fabio Fabi, Italian painter, from, you know, either late 19th century or early 20th century. I can't remember what this one's called. There's one called The Sultan's Favorite. This is one right here. Another Spanish painter in the late 19th century, The Sultan's Favorite, right? He painted this 1886, right? All of these paintings, what they do is they, I'll just read this from Zachary Lockman. The images that writers and painters influenced by this cultural Orientalism evoked were sometimes eroticized and titillating, drawing on and further developing much older European depictions of Muslims as violent, lusty, and sexually perverse. Even if you think about the painting that's on the cover of the book Orientalism, a naked boy, you know, a snake charmer performing for these older men. It's a very dehumanizing depiction of Muslims, which again was the product of that. You know, this painting wasn't the product of the Muslim world, but the product of a European imagination about the Muslim world. And gendered Orientalism, basically women were depicted in two extremes, either as downtrodden victims who are imprisoned, secluded, shrouded, and treated as beasts of burden, or They appeared in a sensual world of excessive sexuality as slaves in harems and the subjects of the gaze of lascivious and violent men, not to mention those looking in. And Laila Abu Lughod argues that artists and writers and even the colonial postcard photographers of the early 20th century preferred the sensual and the sexual. And such depictions of Muslim women, as well as suggestive depictions of boys, gave Europeans a socially acceptable way to express their own fantasies, while simultaneously reaffirming the moral superiority of the West. I want to give another example that's actually not in these slides of how these fantasies play out even in the 21st century. So I'm going to give you an example from a movie. Maybe some of you have watched the movie American Sniper, which was this film made so much money and it was viewed all over the world. And it was supposedly based on the memoir of Chris Kyle, who was considered the deadliest sniper in Iraq, deadliest American sniper in Iraq. Well, it has this scene in the beginning, and if you actually pay attention, in the beginning, you're hearing the call of the prayer. Now, this is important because oftentimes when these films are produced or novels, it's contextualized by some religious terminology, religious performance of religiosity that embeds these acts of violence within a religious frame or a cultural frame. So it re-entrenches for the viewer this idea that this violence, this oppression, this terrorism is because of their religion, right? So with American Sniper, I might have actually no, I might have closed it. I might have a picture to show you. Just put American Sniper here. So in American Sniper, there's this is what I want to show you. This picture, right? So it shows us, and it's a very dehumanizing scene for so many reasons, but it shows this Iraqi mother as just so hateful and violent that she doesn't even bat an eye when her son dies in front of her eyes, which, by the way, it never happened. And if you can read about it, this entire scene is a figment of Clint Eastwood's imagination that he embeds in the film. And the question is why? Well, Chris Kyle says he shoots a woman who had a Chinese grenade and there was no kid with her. He never mentions a kid at all. But Clint Eastwood decides to embellish this thing that supposedly happened and make her a mom in the scene that gives the grenade to her son, right? Putting her son, and by the way, there's so much anti-Arab racism happening in that scene because that is what we consistently hear when Arab children die in Gaza and the West Bank. What do we always hear? Oh, well, their parents put them in the front lines to die. That is the farthest thing from the truth. And that is the most dehumanizing thing you can say about an Arab mom who cares about her children as much as any other woman in the world. And for Clint Eastwood to start off this movie, right, with portraying an Iraqi mom as willing to just put her child out there to kill U.S. Marines and doesn't bat an eye when he dies, just goes to pick up the grenade herself to throw it at them. This is an incomplete embellishment of the truth. This never happened. And the question becomes, why do they even put these scenes in there? Why dehumanize Arab moms in this way and Muslim moms? And of course, she's wearing the hijab, right? Dressed very conservatively. So these images matter and these stories matter and how we tell these stories matter. And oftentimes what we think is the truth is actually, again, a figment of the imagination of the painter, the writer, the film producer. And I just want to quote this, and I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to try to wrap up. But I mentioned foreign policy. Well, it was like that in the past and in the present. So Layla Ahmed, who's a Harvard professor, wrote the book Women and Gender in Islam. She writes here, the idea that other men, right, in quotation, men in colonized societies or societies beyond the borders of the civilized West oppressed women was to be used in the rhetoric of colonialism to render morally justifiable its project of undermining or eradicating the cultures of colonized people, right? So basically, what happens is colonizers appropriate feminist rhetoric, although they were not feminists by any means, and there's a lot to show that they, excuse me, this, I'm gonna have to stop sharing because this thing freezes on me sometimes when I share my screen. So they appropriated feminist discourse to try to morally legitimate the colonial project and try to say this is why we're there. We're there to save their women. So, for example, you have Britain's chief representative in Egypt, Lord Cromer, who basically said, you know, the reasons why Islam as a social system has been a complete failure are manifold. First and foremost, Islam keeps women in a position of marked inferiority. And so what we see is then he uses this idea of Islam as a social system being demeaning to women to argue this is why we're there, which is why not why the British were in Egypt, and this is why we need to save their women, right? And save their women from what? And this is where Gayatri Spivak says, you know, colonial administrators wanted to save brown women from brown men, and it was used to impart the civilizing mission to their imperialist project. The French did the same in Algeria, by the way, right? Um, they basically, as one historian argues, female Muslim status became a key measurement for judging the culturally alien, politically passive other. So I want to kind of just demonstrate to you, we can spend so much time just in the colonial era, but I want to demonstrate how far back this rhetoric of saving Muslim women from Muslim men, how far back it's going. And even in 2001, if you listen to Laura Bush's address in November 2001, her radio address on invading Afghanistan, it was all about saving Afghan women. And she ends by saying, because of our military advances in Afghanistan, women in Afghanistan can now celebrate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the problem is that, as Laila Abu Lughod argues, that we often use this idea of saving Muslim women to wage war on their countries. We don't ask, are they any safer? Are their lives any better when we are destroying their civilian infrastructure? When we're dropping bombs and making their lives less secure, when they're not able to send their children to school? Are we really making women's lives any better? Those are the kind of questions we need to be asking. And finally, I just want to end by saying that, you know, now there's this genre of pulp nonfiction. It echoes these Orientalist tropes. It's this new genre of mass market paperbacks that play on the theme of the oppressed Muslim woman. And although they are told in the first person of individual women, the traumas and abuses they catalog do not present themselves to readers as unique to these individuals. They are always contextualized by culture. They're often co-authored by a Western author or ghostwriter. And the problem with that, as I said, oppression needs to be called out, right? I believe, yes, dirty laundry needs to be aired out, and we need to call out the abuse. But what happens, in particular, what's problematic is that these women's narratives are not read as specific to those individuals. Readers will mistakenly think that they're learning something about those places and cultures when they read them, because they get absorbed into this general vision of Islam land, right? Mohaja Kaf, who's a professor of English, of world literature at the University of Arkansas, she writes about she calls it the victim escapee stereotype in literature. She said it appears at every level of culture, pop to high, and it's specifically about Muslim women. She says it is hegemonic, which means it is not seen as a stereotype, but as a truth, that Islam is exceptionally, uniquely, inherently evil to women seems to be one of the received truths of our era, axiomatic. And she argues, she calls it, you know, the pity committee, you know, and she says, join the pity committee and you too can consume a fresh Muslim woman victim flavor every season. The job of mascot for the pity committee escapee of the month is a tempting career opportunity if you are a Muslim woman. If you sign up, the pity committee will give you a book deal much plumpier than the one I got from my small publisher. All you have to do is have a victimization story. A clitoridectomy or arranged marriage will do, as well as honor killing. If you don't have one, you can make one up, like Norma Khoury, and still be believed by a readership primed by centuries of bigoted images of Islam. So Norma Khoury, actually, it was found out that her entire novel was fake, was fictional, when she claimed it was based on her best friend. And it first came out that the reason it was so popular was because it was a story of an honor killing. So of course, we wouldn't question that. Oh, of course, Muslim countries must kill their women, you know, for an honor, like for supposedly an honor crime, right? So Norma Khoury, there was an investigative journalist, Rana Husseini, who actually has done so much advocacy for real victims of honor crimes, not fictional ones, for real victims of honor crimes. She's Jordanian. She writes for the Jordan Times. My mother's Jordanian. I've known about her work for so long. I've engaged with Rana Husseini's work. And here is someone, Rana Husseini, who's actually doing real work, advocating for real victims of honor crimes. And then she reads Norma Khouri's book, and she's the first one who recognizes a lot of holes in her story and finds out that this entire thing was fictional. And I'm going to just, there's so many examples, both films and books with these pop cultural representations. And I'll just end by saying that by situating a compelling plot or narrative within the context of this foreign geography that most of the readers or viewers wouldn't know about, in this foreign religion or culture, it lends credence to these Islamophobic ideas that view all problems in the Muslim world as a product of that place, religion, or culture. So we walk away thinking, oh, we watch a film like Not Without My Daughter, right? And we would think, oh my gosh, all Iranian men are just abusive. Iranian culture condones this abuse, right? And the film does a really good job of teaching us, because films are always teaching us lessons, right? And some of you may have watched this as a 1992 film or 1991. No, I think it's 1991. The film teaches us that Betty's experience with a violent, abusive, and dishonest husband and aggressive, controlling in-laws are not particular to her own experience. Rather, the film teaches us that her experience is a byproduct of Islam and Iranian culture. And if I had more time, I would give you specific examples of how the film does this. But the real Betty Mahmoudi, actually, there's an interview, and I show it to my students, that the real person that this film was supposed to portray. And she says the complete opposite, right? And if I had time, I would show you that interview, but she says the complete opposite. She says, I really hope viewers don't walk away thinking that all Iranians were like that. She goes, these were my in-laws. She says they were much more extreme than most Iranians. They were really extreme. And she said the majority of Iranians were not like that. She said, in fact, strangers on the street wanted to help me and my daughter. And it was strangers on the street who gave us money and said, pay us back another day, and helped her escape Iran. So these very same brown Muslim men who the film makes us think are all evil and violent and abusive are actually, in fact, the men who helped Betty Mahmoudi and her daughter escape Iran. That's what happens in reality versus the fictional way this film is reproduces the story. So I'll end with that. But I'll just say, I realize that all of this is tied to gendered Islamophobia, and it is, I argue, the reason why Muslim women until today disproportionately are the victims of Islamophobic incidents. So while the majority of victims of hate crimes tend to be men outside of the Muslim communities, like outside the Muslim community, within the Muslim community, women bear the brunt of the rising level of Islamophobia since 9/11. And there's a lot of data to support that from ISPU, which is Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. Noura Siddiq also showed that 62.4% of Muslim women believe discrimination against Muslims is a major problem, whereas for men, it's almost half of that. And I had written a book chapter, which you can find online, called "Violent, Oppressed, and Un-American Muslim Women in the American Imagination," and we chronicle the stories of women who talk to us about the abuses and discrimination they face in America, especially after Trump was elected in 2016. They felt that it was a lot worse. In fact, they argued, this was from 2016, that 2016 was worse for them than after 9/11. That the anti-Muslim rhetoric and experiences they faced were worse. So yeah, I'll end with that, and thank you so much for indulging me.
We are going to be calling you for part 2. I could listen to this all day because you're so enlightening, and wow, we all needed to hear this and more.
Thank you, Luba.
If
Thank
you'll
you.
send me the name of that you said we could find online that you had written,
Oh, yeah.
I'll share that with everybody. But we always open it up for discussions, and then we have, after we close in a few minutes, we have the after the amen time, that if anybody wants to stay and keep talking this topic, politics, anything else, we have the after the amen time that we all just have a more serious conversation. Questions, thoughts?
Thank you for opening our eyes. I didn't have any idea that what the women were going through. And we don't know what's truth when we're reading or seeing a film, because we're not in the culture. We don't know the culture. So of course, if you read, it's like, oh, that must be happening. So
Mhm.
thank you for opening our eyes towards that.
Thank you, Ashanti. You know what I would say to that is I tell my students oftentimes, we know of so many horrific cases in America, right? Where whether it's domestic violence or rape or abduction. So I think of like Ariel Castro, who was a school bus driver in Ohio and kidnapped these three women and put them in their base. It was a horrific, horrific story. I think in fact there's probably been a movie made of it, right? I asked my students, I'm like, did anyone go, school bus drivers, they must be so like evil.
Yeah.
So, or Ohio, men in Ohio, what's in
Yeah.
the water in Ohio that they go and kidnap women. And they're like, yeah, like we didn't do that. Like no one is contextualizing that story of abuse, which was a real story and a horrific story, and of course a story that needs to be shared. But we never contextualized it by like, oh, it's the culture, it's American men, or it's school bus drivers, but yet we tend to do that with stories of abuse when we are in a foreign culture, and we tend to think, oh, that all Pakistani men must be abusive, or
Yes.
it's a religious problem, it's a cultural problem. Where usually no, it's that individual. He is a violent person. Well, let's try to understand why he's acting abusive and violent, and oftentimes we're going to find parallels between the Western man who behaves that way and the Muslim man who finds that way. We're going to find very similar parallels that can explain the phenomena of violence and abuse, especially within the family.
When a crime is committed, and mostly when it's a Caucasian or white person, we don't say, oh, that's those Protestants. Oh, that's those Catholics. That's those Baptists.
That's right.
We immediately go to, oh, he's had a rough upbringing. Oh, he's got some mental health issues. We start excusing it in other ways. But when it's a Muslim person that's committed the crime, we instantly go to, it's the Quran, it's his religion, and it's so wrong.
But
It's
one
just,
thing that I'd like you to remember is that in the 19th century, they blamed the Catholics, they blamed the Irish, they blamed the
Yep.
Italians. We didn't have any Muslims to blame.
right.
Yeah.
You blame who you can.
Yeah.
It's almost like white supremacy and Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism has been around for so long, and that's always that the name of the game is who's the scapegoat of the day.
Right, at that time, yeah.
Well, it's like the KKK. They claim to be a Christian organization.
Right.
And I'm Christian. I don't want to be blamed for what they do. That's
Right.
not my faith.
That's right.
And
And
but people in groups.
I'm so glad you say that, Melba, because we are asked all the time, Muslims, like I was born in New Jersey and grew up in Panama City. Like, what do I have to do with these terrorist groups out like at ISIS and yet we're asked to apologize for them, right? We're asked to like apologize to the world for their actions. It's like, why are you putting me, like, did you apologize for what the KKK did?
Yeah.
That's my first question. Like, did you put out a statement on your Facebook? Why am I supposed to put it? Why are Muslims being asked to like the idea is like, unless they condemn violence, we have to presume that they're for it. No, that's dehumanizing. That's saying that, when you try to accuse someone of condoning terrorism, that is actually so dehumanizing, because you're telling that person you are an inherently violent person unless you prove otherwise, unless you state otherwise. Yes. Why is that the default?
Right. Good point.
But I also want to add one thing, the reason I get, you could probably hear it in my voice, the reason I get upset about some of this, and I guess it's because the majority of women, of Muslim women that I've met, they are strong women. The vast majority of Muslim women I know, they are strong women. They will stand up for their rights. They will fight for their rights. Yes. They will fight even inside the mosque, all right? They will fight and I think about the women in my family, like my grandmothers. One is still, God preserve her. She's alive in Jordan, and she grew up she's a mother of 7. and she grew up in this conservative tribal society, but she will fight for women's rights, and she would never like stand up. So someone in the family, it was actually her brother-in-law married a second woman, and the family was furious at him. They were furious that, how could he do this? And because it's not considered the norm, even though they're from a small city in Jordan, it was considered a form of like betrayal to the first wife. But, from some of the men will say, well, it was better than him having an affair. At least he married her, and, the daughter's legitimate daughters, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to get involved in that, but I just remember my grandmother's reaction when someone tried to kind of justify that. And she's like, no, we don't do that. We don't like do polygamy in our families, and she, when I think about some of these stories, the way they portray Muslim women as victims of abuse, I don't know from my family, I will say a single woman who would ever put up for a man to raise his hand against a woman, right? Like I don't know a single woman who'd even put up with a man just putting his hand up. Like I know they would put up a fight. Like that's not considered acceptable in any of the Arab families that I personally know, and the families that I come from. My mother-in-law is from Iraq. She grew up in Fallujah, and she tells me the story of a family member of theirs who was disabled. She couldn't walk. She could crawl, but and she found out that her son-in-law, I think it goes something like this, that one time he lifted a hand against her daughter. And she tells me the story. I laugh about it because she brought him over, because it shows you Iraqi women are strong women. She brought him over. She goes, I heard this happened. Is that true? And he goes, I'm sorry, I got angry. She goes, oh, you got angry? And my mother-in-law said this lady, older lady who cannot walk, grabs these two flip-flops and starts hitting this man in revenge for what he did to her daughter, and she said that he became the talk of the town, that, disabled mother-in-law, what fought back, like, you don't do that to my daughter, you don't touch my daughter, and these are the stories that I grew up with, not the stories of, this
Yeah.
culture and civilization just looking the other way and pretending it's not happening.
And in the film yesterday, No Other Land, you'll see when you see it, the women standing up to those soldiers. I mean, in their face. And they weren't cowering and hiding. They were out there in the fight. It was really inspiring to me to see how brave those women were and are. So
Yeah.
that was evident in that film. They weren't hiding anywhere. They were out there.
Women are like that anyway, I think all over the world. I think they are. And this song that I think this song depicts the women all over the world. This song is called Superwoman because we do a lot. We do a lot. Listen to the lyrics by Alicia Keys.
Thank you,
Amen.
Ashanti.
Thank you. My challenge for us today, and Hadia may have another one, is for us to start speaking up. We hear people with those stereotypes. We've got the information. We know what to say, and we know how to say it, and we know how to back it up. And we'll get Hadia and come back with us some other time. But my challenge is that we start speaking up. That we know that's not true. I mean, just say it to people, because we're the people that can change it. I mean, Hadia could say it to a lot of people and they wouldn't listen to her, to be quite honest, because she's Muslim. They'll tend to listen to us because we're not. Or we may get oh, you're just naive, you don't know. Be firm. Yes, I do know.
Right.
So, Hadia, do you have anything to add to that for a challenge for us?
I really appreciate you saying that. And I think, what you're saying. Sorry, I actually mean, and the men also, I think sometimes men have certain legitimacy if it's something about women, right? And it's just the reality of the situation of the patriarchal societies we live in, right?
Yeah.
And so I would highly encourage you to, to say something, but also encourage people to read the Quran. The Quran is constantly being vilified, and for what it's not. It's like, well, have they actually picked it up and read it, and pick up an actual and a good translation? There's some translations you gotta be careful. There are two translations I recommend. The Oxford translation. I'm gonna put it on here, and then Mustafa Khattab. It's called the Clear Quran by the last name is Khattab, and then the Oxford Quran is the other one by M.A.S. Abdul Halim. Those are the two translations I recommend, but there's a whole chapter called the chapter of women, chapter 4. So, I would recommend, if they say that, well, that's not true. Well, just read the Quran,
There's another challenge that we stop talking about something we haven't read.
Yeah.
So I've read some of it, but I don't think I have those translations. I'm going to go back and look. And I want to do that, especially the chapter about women. If anybody wants to stay and continue talking, we have after the amen time, after we sign off here, that's not recorded. But let's have our closing benediction. Today we honor the women of all times and all places, women of courage, women of hope, women suffering and living in fear, women mourning and hurting, women living fully and experiencing the joy of life, women understanding our interconnectedness, women honoring the sacredness of life, and women quietly tend the garden of their families flourishing, women boldly stepping out and leading the transformation of unjust structures, women seeking wisdom, women sharing wisdom, women receiving love, women giving love. We call you by many names: God, Allah, the great mystery, the spirit of the universe, Jehovah. And on this day, help us to commit ourselves to the full humanity of all women everywhere. We know that whatever denies, diminishes, and distorts the full humanity of women is not holy. Help us to always be faithful to the call of love. Amen.
We extinguish this candle, we extinguish this flame, but we keep the light in our hearts with the message of love and justice, taking it outside of these walls into the world in which we live in, until we see each other again. Amen, Ashe, and may it be so. Now go in peace. Ashe.
Thank you.